Good evening, everyone. My name is Katie Zontak, and I'm the Cultural Arts Director of the JCC in Buffalo. I want to welcome you all to tonight's final Tuesday Talkback, which is part of the Buffalo International Jewish Film Festival, wrapping up its first ever virtual film festival this coming week. Tonight's Talkback is in conjunction with the film The Spy Behind Home Plate, which had the most ticket sales out of all 11 films that we've shown this festival, so it was a popular one. I'd like to thank our film festival sponsor, the Louis and Molly B. Wolk Foundation, for sponsoring the film. And I'd like to introduce Rick Collins, a volunteer member of our film festival committee and the facilitator for tonight's talkback. And I just quickly also want to acknowledge, make sure that you share your themed outfit with everybody, because I love how dedicated you were to getting in touch with the baseball theme tonight. So thank you so much, Rick.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for all the work you and Patricia Quinn have done. And so on behalf of Mike Silverman and our committee, Mike is our chair, I'd like to welcome you, baseball fans, Jewish fans, and spy fans. And if you think you're watching the Democratic National Convention, you're in the wrong place, because we're going to leave politics aside tonight and talk about espionage, talk about baseball, talk about Jewish immigration. And I'm so pleased that our guest panelist is Charlie Novogrodsky, someone I've known for many, many years. We both work together in Toronto, and we share a love of baseball and the Blue Jays. But I hate to tell you, Charlie, the Blue Jays are now in Buffalo, as you can see here.
Oh, wow.
And so you've lost them and we've gained them. It's kind of ironic, though. Charlie's an American. He was born in New York State and lived a while in Florida, went to Brandeis University. And then for more than 50 years now, he's been in Toronto. And now I'm in New York. But despite the rumors, we did not get traded for each other. We just got traded for future considerations. It should also be noted that Charlie, as well as being a big baseball fan and a researcher, was past president of the JCC in Toronto, very involved in the Jewish community, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And now that he's retired, he's got more time for research and baseball with his wife, Myra, and his sons and 5 grandchildren. So Charlie, welcome to YouTube and Zoom, and we look forward to hearing your introduction.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Katie. Wow, it's baseball is Moe Berg during a pandemic. Can you see this? There's my favorite baseball card. I hope you can see it. That's Moe Berg, part of the series of American Jewish baseball players that 140 or some odd Jews have played professional baseball since the 1870s. And what I wanted to do tonight was, first of all, say hello to everybody. We have an international audience, I do believe. I want to say hi to friends and family who may be watching. Of course, we want everyone to be safe. And in Canada, you may have heard that one of the ways we're surviving the pandemic is we try to sign off with pandemic updates by telling everybody to be kind. And that's my wish for all of you to get through this in a healthy way. I'm going to be assuming people have seen the film, The Spy Behind Home Plate, by Aviva Kempner. It's a really good documentary. You know, when we're talking about Moe Berg, there's a biography of Moe Berg. Most people think it's partially okay. It has some good information. There's also the feature film made about Moe Berg. It's mostly a spy story. And I think if you saw Aviva's film, you'll agree with me that Moe's life is an extraordinary life, the whole life. The time he was born, from the time he was born in 1902 until he passed away at the age of in 1970, Moe was an extraordinary person. And I'm hoping to maybe spend 20 minutes or so with you folks before questions. I'll show you a few slides that come from a talk I give on Jewish contribution to the game of baseball. And I'm hoping that by showing you some of my favorite slides, telling you a little bit about what I know of Moe Berg and the connections between Moe and what else was going on in the world with Jews in America, and frankly, with being a male Jewish American baseball player, I'm hoping to extend the thinking and context for understanding Moe's life. I think it sheds a lot of light on those topics. So let me switch over to my slideshow. It's nice to see all of you. And I showed you the baseball card. And there he is on the right. He's 36 years old. He's playing for the Boston Red Sox, but he had hurt his knee, as some of you heard from the Aviva's movie. So he was already in his 30s and about to retire from Major League Baseball. I love this picture of him, I have to tell you. And that's his friend, Jimmy Fox, in the middle, a famous third baseman. And on the left is Rick Farrell with a catcher's mitt on as well. Incidentally, before I forget to mention, online, there's a National Jewish Baseball Museum, which has Moe Berg's catcher's glove as a leading image. I would encourage all of you to check that out. When did I first hear about this man? This man, Moe Berg, was catching for the White Sox, later the Senators, when my own father lived in New York City and was in his 20s. And my father would go to Yankee Stadium to watch the Yankees play teams like the Cleveland Indians, Chicago White Sox, Moe's teams. And my father didn't have that much money, so he would sit in the less expensive seats overlooking the bullpen, where the relief pitchers would warm up. And that's where the substitute catchers had their job. And he had heard about this catcher in the bullpen. He'd heard he was Jewish, but he heard more than that. He heard that he was forever telling stories. He was forever talking to the fans who were leaning over the fence above the bullpen, and he went. And I remember many, many times my father describing Moe Berg either sitting in the bullpen or warming up a pitcher who might be going into the game. And he would look up, there'd be some Italian kids yelling down to him, and he would answer them in Italian. And then there would be some Dominicans or Puerto Ricans or other Spanish-speaking Americans. He would kid around with them, toss them a baseball, and speak to them in Spanish. My father yelled at him in Yiddish, my father's first language. That was also Moe's first language. In his family, they spoke Yiddish even after they moved to New Jersey when Moe was a little boy. And on and on and on. There's some controversy about how many languages Moe actually spoke. I've seen numbers ranging from 10 to 14. And you'll recall the famous story on his second trip to Japan. He's on the boat with Babe Ruth, and there's an incredible group of all-stars, including Lou Gehrig. And Babe says to Moe, they had just met then, more or less, on this boat trip in 36, I should say. And Babe says to Moe, do you speak Japanese? And Moe says, no, I was there once before, which is true. In 32, Moe had been on a teaching trip to Japan and had started to pick up Japanese. He says to Babe 4 years later, no, I don't speak Japanese. And 3 weeks later, that ship sailed from Vancouver to Yokohama. Moe gets off that ship and is fluently speaking Japanese to the diplomats and baseball officials who greeted them. And Babe says to Moe, Moe, I thought you said you don't speak Japanese. And Moe says, that was 3 weeks ago. So that's this guy. May I say that he and his family were part of a third wave of Jewish immigrants to America. You know, the first wave is the wave of Sephardic Jews coming early in the 1600s, settling in places like New Amsterdam, now New York. The Newport, Rhode Island Jewish community is a Sephardic Jewish community. And then in the mid-1840s, actually fleeing from revolutions in Europe, the so-called German Jews began to arrive. Let me show you one of them. I'm going to show you on this card. I hope you can see it. Is that working? This is the famous Lippmann Pike. He is considered a Jewish man. born of Dutch parents in the United States who had arrived in the US. He had an older brother named Boaz. Lippman Pike is reported to be the first professional paid baseball player ever in the major leagues. In the 1870s, he played right through for 15 or 20 years. And he was part of that second massive, excuse me, Jewish immigration. But with Moe, we are talking about the third massive immigration, starting in, well, you know, I would say the 1900s, maybe a little bit before. Over 2 million Jews came from Eastern Europe. These were Jews fleeing murderous pogroms in places like Russia. Moe's father was fleeing pogroms in what's today the Ukraine. They were fleeing for their lives. When these Jews arrived in America, they were lucky to be alive, thrilled to be in this golden land, although their circumstances were terribly difficult. If you've seen and read about the situation on the Lower East Side. This is the background from which Moe Berg emerged. At the time he himself became a Major League Baseball player after he graduated from Princeton, there had only been some 20 American Jewish men who had become baseball players. Lippman Pike was one of them. I like his face in this picture. Let me just show you another couple. Here's Moe at Princeton. This one is from probably 1920. Some of you will know that Moe entered Princeton, very unusual for a Jewish kid to get into Princeton. There were quotas in 1919. He had been a good ball player. He had gone to a Catholic school in New Jersey, had to change his name at the suggestion of his coach. A significant event. Here's this 16-year-old, an outstanding baseball player in New Jersey, entering this baseball world. His family was a Jewish American family, but not practicing Jews. We would call them cultural Jews, I would say, under pretty extreme pressures from their father, who had done menial jobs when he first arrived in America in the 1880s. And then Moe himself had made this difficult choice to go to Princeton as a terrific ball player and find an identity. And he went towards baseball as his major identity. He was probably one of one or two Jews altogether at Princeton at this time, but he became well known because he was such a good ball player. And of course, we all get a kick out of that story of he and his second baseman, Moe played shortstop, being asked, what do you do? You're talking Latin to befuddle opposing base runners. What do you do if someone from Harvard knows Latin? And Moe famously said, we switched to Sanskrit, Sanskrit was one of his favorite languages. May I also say that this entire time we're talking about, the time of Moe's birth, 1902, into the time of his entrance to Princeton, something else was going on in America. Teddy Roosevelt was the president of the United States from 1901 to 1908. And he had a big worry. His worry was that the men of America were no longer masculine and tough. The Industrial Revolution had meant that American men had moved into cities where they had soft office jobs. And he had two big responses to this worry about the manliness of the American people. President Teddy Roosevelt believed people should get outdoors. So he was a big naturalist and outdoors guy, and he believed in sports. And he believed in promoting people playing sports and promoting professional sports. Baseball had become professional about 30 years before Teddy Roosevelt became president. And Moe Berg was entering the baseball world right at the time that these great successes happened. How many languages, which languages did he speak? Well, he graduated magna cum laude. Here's the list. Moe Berg was fluent for sure in Hebrew and Yiddish, Yiddish from the family, Hebrew from whatever prayer exposures he had, Latin and Greek. Those were his two favorites. I have to tell you, one of my biggest regrets in life is I once had the opportunity from a secondhand bookstore in Toronto to take a Latin book, Cicero, I think it was, with Moe Berg's signature in it. And for some reason, I didn't really know that much about Moe. I was a younger man. I did not buy that book. Oh my. Regrets. Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, German. Let me say those four again. French, Spanish, Italian, German. You know, if you've seen Aviva's film, that after his retirement, he became a spy. When he was in Europe, including at least twice being sent into Nazi-occupied Europe, he used those languages to blend into the local population and fulfill his spy missions. Reportedly, his French, Spanish, Italian, and German accents made him virtually indistinguishable from a native speaker. Sanskrit, he later spoke Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Hindi, Arabic, which of course is related to Hebrew, Portuguese, and Hungarian. I have my doubts about the Hungarian. He was never in Hungary. It's famously a very hard language to learn. I'm not sure about that. While at Princeton, he had incidentally been at NYU earlier, and he's a kid. We're talking about 17, 18. He became the best ball player on their team. He was invited to what today we would call a fraternity. At Princeton, they called it an eating club. One of the ball players invited Moe. When Moe was getting ready to accept the invitation, he found out there was a condition that he could join the eating club and enjoy the privileges of special meals and sitting in the prestigious dining rooms at Princeton, only if he did not recruit any other Jews to join the eating club at Princeton. And Moe said, if that's the condition, then count me out. So we have these interesting examples. Moe having to change his name when he was 14, 15, because his name sounded too Jewish at the Catholic school in Newark. We have Moe standing up for perhaps other Jewish students, however few they may have been at Princeton, not participating. It's interesting. Moe signed as a professional ball player with the team that later came to be the Brooklyn Dodgers. At that time, they were called the Brooklyn Robins in 1921. He was being sought after in those early 1920s by the two New York teams, the Brooklyn team and the Giants. I don't think the Yankees were interested in Moe. He had a pretty good reputation already as a ball player. He was a tremendous fielder. His hitting was questionable, but the management of both the Brooklyn team and the New York team was interested in Jewish players. Why? Because they knew that Jewish players would attract more Jewish fans to the ballpark. They would make more money off them. So these were players who were called help the gate players. Now you might ask, what's my daddy doing in this presentation? My father, who told me about Moe, as I said, is here pictured at age 5. So this would be 1917, right when Moe was just getting already in print, getting ready to go to Princeton. And this picture costs 5 cents in the year 17. I like it a lot, as you can imagine. And this very same boy in 1924, at the age of 12, got a job. My father was living in the Lower East Side, and just give me some patience here. I'm coming to baseball and Jews and Moe. He got a job with the early wireless sets in the 1924 World Series, where a platform would be set up. My father would put a headphone on. There'd be a big chalkboard, a giant chalkboard with the form of a baseball diamond. And my father's job was to listen to what was happening in the game and record it in chalk on the giant chalkboard. 300 people would gather and watch, in this case, Game 4 of the 1924 World Series. How do I know that's when that was? My grandfather, my father's father, on that game and that late afternoon, climbed up onto that platform, ripped those earphones off my father, his 12-year-old son, and pulled him off that platform because it was Erev Yom Kippur. The most sacred night of the Jewish calendar was coming up. You can imagine how shocked my grandfather was to see his son in front of this non-Jewish audience recording a baseball game. And I have often felt that at that moment, with one arm being pulled by his father, representing the immigrant world, the older world, the religious world that my father was actually going to school in, and the headset representing the new America that the family had come to, that tug going in opposite directions perfectly corresponds to the same tug that Moe Berg felt. If you saw Viva's film, you'll know that although the mother of Moe Berg, Rose, was happy that her son was a well-known ball player, the father, whose other son became a doctor and whose daughter, sole daughter, became a school teacher. It's what women could do in those days if they wanted to work. We wanted Moe to be a lawyer. And Moe was being tugged by his father's more traditional desire about how an immigrant family should get ahead, get an education, go into a profession, you're a bright boy, versus Moe's extraordinary desire, I'm going to use the expression, to join America by being a baseball player, including being a professional baseball player. Now, isn't it interesting? And I don't want to do too much amateur psychology here tonight. And incidentally, there's a lot of mysteries about the life of Moe Berg. But is it possible, I'll put it in the form of a question, that Moe Berg entered the world of baseball as a way of saying goodbye to some of the tradition, some of the ways of his secular, but very much culturally Jewish family? And is it not significant that Moe's father, who knew how bright his son was, who knew how he had graduated magna cum laude at Princeton, who knew what abilities he had, would refuse throughout his entire remaining life? Moe's father refused to ever see him play a professional baseball game. When the brother, towards the end of Moe's career, said, "Daddy," well, maybe in the middle of Moe's career, we're in the middle of a depression, at least Moe's earning a living, the rest of us are struggling, 1930s, why don't you go see him play? The father, Moe's father, turned and spit on the ground to show his disdain for the activity of sports, for the choice of a baseball career for his own son. And it was one of the greatest regrets of Moe's life that his father never saw him play. This is the famous, I think it's a famous diagram from the Jewish Forward. That was the Yiddish newspaper that the immigrants to New York City used to figure out how to integrate into US society. And people would write in Yiddish, what should we do? Should we let our children play baseball? Should we let them play football? And the editor of the Forward famously said, "Don't let them play football. That's a game for wild runners." And you might not be able to see the quotation here. Let me read it to you. In 1903, Moe is only 1 year old, this quotation appeared in the Jewish Forward. It says, "Let your boy play baseball and play it well. Let us," meaning Jews, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, "not so raise the children that they should grow up foreigners in their own birthplace." And what is it we're looking at here? It's a diagram. It's education to help the Jewish readers, most of whom only spoke Yiddish, to understand the game of baseball. I think it's just a fantastic diagram. I'm a big fan of it. Similarly, this particular photograph on the Lower East Side in New York City shows Jewish kids playing stickball famously in the tenements underneath the hanging laundry. You can see on the right the old wagon, the kids watching the stickball game. Easy, rubber game, rubber ball. Could use a broom handle. Looks like some babies and girls on the left. And my father grew up in neighborhoods that looked just like this. And Moe's family left New York City, excuse me, to go to a more middle class neighborhood in the fresh air of Newark, New Jersey. But Moe knew that baseball was in the air. Some of you may not recognize this man. His name is Albert von Tilzer, wasn't his real name. But when we talk about Jews in baseball and what was surrounding Moe Berg as a kid, I think we cannot fail to mention Albert. You know the song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Either the second or third most well-known song in the history of the United States. This man wrote it. Look at him there. I love that coat. His father, Albert von Tilzer's father, ran a shoe store in Goshen, Indiana. The family was very musical. The older brother, Harry, became a successful songwriter. And three other brothers were Tin Pan Alley music publishers. Albert changed his last name, so you don't see the name of the family there, which was Gum, G-U-M-M. Jacob and Sarah Gumbinowski was the full name. The father changed it to Gum. Albert changed it to Albert von Tilzer. But he changed his name not because of anti-Semitism. He changed it for theatrical purposes. He hoped to compose music like his brother. He moved to New York City from Indiana in 1900, 2 years before Moe was born. Along with his brother, Albert had a lot of success. You know the song, I'll Be With You in Apple Blossom Time, he wrote it. But the most amazing thing is that on the New York subway one day in 1908, I believe Moe's family would already have moved with him as a young boy to New Jersey. Albert is riding the subway and the Giants were playing in their famous ballpark called the Polo Grounds. And there's a sign up, baseball today at the Polo Grounds. And Albert looks at the sign and he and his lyricist, Jack Norworth, decide to write a song. Albert writes the music, Norworth writes the lyrics. Neither one of them, when they wrote Take Me Out to the Ball Game, had never seen a baseball game in their lives. I don't know, for all I know, Albert and his family had seen that diagram I showed you. It was another 20 years, 1928, before Albert ever actually saw a game. And despite that he'd never seen a game, their song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, uniquely and forever captured the deep rhythms of the game of baseball. For example, Carl Erskine, a very famous Brooklyn Dodgers pitcher in the 1950s, claimed that the song had to have been written for pitchers. 1, 2, 3 strikes you're out. The quarter rest pause between take and me and the first measure of the chorus is the perfect spot for the thwack sound of a ball hitting the bat. The part we sing today is actually the chorus. There was a musical made, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, with Frank Sinatra, Gene Kelly in 1949. By that time, the song was already a part of American folklore. Sinatra sang the title song. Von Tilzer himself died in a nursing home in 1956 at the age of 78. The last thing he ever saw on TV in the home was the Ed Sullivan Show, where, because it was on the eve of the 1956 Baseball World Series, Ed Sullivan was interviewing the famous baseball players, Hank Aaron and Yogi Berra. Albert's nurse tucked him in after the interview, and Albert went to sleep, and he never woke up. Just one last comment here. Two more comments quickly on just baseball surrounding Moe during his career. These are the famous Elias brothers. They were born in South Carolina and moved to New York City around the time Moe was born. And they were hustlers trying to earn a living other than selling salad oil, which is what Al on the left, Al Elias, did. They realized they were good with math. They could write on little cards the statistics for the players playing that game. They'd go stand outside Yankee Stadium or the Polo Grounds or the Brooklyn Ballpark, and they would hand out these cards. And they realized that people would have an interest in more than just that game. So they started keeping statistics about all the leading batters. And so every week or so, they could put out a list of the leading batters. And the newspapers got really interested in this. And in 1922, the Elias brothers were hired to begin to publish their statistics in the newspapers. Well, the rest is history. Moe was 20 years old when those statistics started to appear. He just signed his own professional contract. The Elias brothers formed eventually what is called the Elias Bureau of Sports, or the Elias Sports Bureau. The business was sold after they passed away, and to this day, whether it's professional football, baseball, basketball, the main statistics being produced and disseminated come and originate from the Elias brothers. Remember, I mentioned that the owners of baseball teams in New York City wanted more Jewish players. And this is Moe, sometimes called Moe's Solomon. This is baseball card. In the early part of the 20th century, those New York baseball teams were looking for what they called the Jewish Babe Ruth. They wanted guys who could hit home runs, and Moe Solomon was one of them, to begin playing for a New York team and to attract fans, make money at the gate for fans wanting to see these Jewish players. Moe Solomon had a couple of good years, but then tailed off. He didn't have a long career. For a while, the nickname they gave him was the Rabbi of SWAT. Babe Ruth was already hitting many home runs for the New York Yankees. He was called the Sultan of SWAT, so this was the Jewish equivalent. 7 players named Cohen were signed during this period by teams in New York. Most of them changed their names. There was another one, Andy Cohen, who used to do a lot of soft drink advertisements in Yiddish that appeared in the Jewish Forward. All this by way of saying that Moe Berg and Jews in baseball were not entirely new, but they were growing during this time of Moe's career. And I wanted to just comment briefly on the overall question of Jews as ball players. How well the Jews match up when it comes to non-Jewish ball players? Well, as we speak today, in the year 2020, approximately 1% of all people who were good enough to become Major League ball players have been Jews. Jews are 3% of the total population. So you might say, well, why weren't there more? Or why aren't there more? The batting average is good. The average batting average for all Jewish players up to our present time is approximately 265. That's 3 points higher than the average batting average of the thousands of ball players who played since the start of professional baseball. With pitching, we do very well. Of all the pitchers, our pitchers have won 20 games over 500 if you put their total games together. This is very, very good, but it's skewed. That's because one of the greatest pitchers of all times was Sandy Koufax. He won so many games that makes the rest of the Jewish players look good. Let me just, before I show you my last piece, and I know Rick's going to want to come back on when I end the slides, what can we say about this guy, Moe Berg, especially about his choice to spy on Nazi atomic research and to get resistance, leading resistance fighters out of Europe, in Nazi-occupied Europe? This man who did not experience that much anti-Semitism during the time of his career. He was very personable. He was a famous storyteller. He helped young players with his deep knowledge of baseball. But he knew so much that he could help people with his other deep knowledge. There's a famous story told of a spring training barnstorming kind of tour in the 1930s, and the bus got lost. I think it was when he was playing for the White Sox. In the middle of the night, Moe Berg is on the team. He gets out of the bus. Half the guys are sleeping. The bus driver says, I have absolutely no idea where I am and which way to go. And Moe looks up at the stars. He calculates using the stars the general direction that they need to go in. and away they go. And similarly, Moe was famous for his broad knowledge that put him on radio, on the radio quiz shows. And check Wikipedia for some of the questions he was asked. It is extraordinary the way he could speak. And incidentally, very poignantly, when it comes to the war itself and Moe and his brother, we ought to remember that in 1942, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Moe was already out of baseball for 2 years. He had done that semi-official spying by filming Tokyo Harbor on his second trip to Japan. In 1942, if you can believe it, Moe Berg was put on shortwave radio, full radio, whatever the proper name for it is, and he officially broadcast into Japan, which was at war with the United States and a good part of the rest of the world, including Canada. And he, the Japanese people, to overthrow the emperor and end the war. And he told them, speaking in fluent Japanese, that they could not win the war, and he would like to restore the baseball and diplomatic and person-to-person friendships that they had established during the 2 trips in the 1930s. Quite amazingly, the day Moe retired from baseball in 1939 was the day his father passed away. His father never saw him play a game. It is fair to say that Moe may have been responding to the natural desire to be admired and respected by your father, who could not respect him for his professional choice, still didn't respect him when Moe part-time during the winters went to law school and actually became a lawyer, joined what was then the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and became one of Major Donovan's chief spies in Europe, especially on the Nazi atomic program. Was he somehow trying to win the already deceased father's approval? We'll never know. Let me just say this, that when the war ended, Moe came back. He did a few more years' work for the OSS, and then starting in 1950, he started living with his brother, the physician, Sam. He lived with him for 17 years. He never worked. He saw a lot of women. He was a man about town. Moe had many, many friends in diplomatic circles. His own brother had to kick him out of the house after 17 years because Moe, in a funny way, never found independence. Can you imagine that after all that he had lived through before? And he had to go live with his sister the last few years of his life. And he passed away living in his sister's house. In the 1960s, they attempted to sign a book contract for Moe to write his own autobiography. He was very reticent to talk about anything connected with the war, famously so. And they sent a writer from the publishing house to be his ghostwriter. So Moe, a little bit antisocial, I would say at this point, sits down with this guy. And this guy thinks he's one of the Three Stooges. One of the Three Stooges was named Moe. Moe, Curly, and something, I forget. And Moe Berg gets up and leaves the interview and never wrote his autobiography. So to conclude, let me show you this. I want to thank Rick for this. This is the famous article. Here's the famous picture of Moe with his catcher's gear on. This is the famous article that Moe wrote 2 years after he retired in the Atlantic, now called the Atlantic Monthly. You can read for yourself. The famously brainy catcher breaks down the psychology and physiology behind baseball pitches 2 years after retiring. The catcher has to be able to cock his arm from any position, throw fast and accurately, et cetera, et cetera. And then look at this, typical of Berg. He makes a reference to Greek mythology, saying the catcher is like the Cerberus of baseball. Who's the Cerberus? That's the two-headed, multi-headed dog who guarded the gates of Hades, the place of the dead in Greek mythology, to keep the dead from coming back onto the earth and resume living. So what Moe was saying he does is to contain, the catcher contains the game of baseball from getting too wild and from its ghosts and difficult icons and people from getting out of hand. And it was, I thought, kind of interesting. You know, Einstein read this article when he and Moe had their famous tea at Princeton after the war. And Aviva talks about Einstein saying it's going to take me longer to learn baseball than it would take you to learn the mathematics I work with. Finally, I would say that Moe Berg, interestingly, went into baseball most likely to leave Judaism behind and to become an American. And he saw baseball as the vehicle for doing that. Hank Greenberg, the very famous, most famous player of the 1930s, and one of the greatest baseball players who ever lived, similarly said that he wanted to be a great baseball player. But then Greenberg later in his life said, as it all played out, and I became so well known, especially amongst the Jewish community, I began to want to become a great Jewish baseball player. And so in that way, I think we could start to think about baseball in Moe's life. Did Moe join baseball in order to leave Judaism behind and enter America, get away from whatever ethnic slurs he may have experienced when he was young? But then did he go, in a sense, fight in World War II, partly, not just as an American, but as a Jew? Moe was very aware of Hitler and the early information on the Holocaust. And interestingly enough, where is he buried? He's buried on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. His ashes are there. And at his request, we think, or certainly his sister felt, that that would be his desire. So when we think about Moe Berg, I think we can think a lot about how he learned to be a man, how he learned to be an American and a Jew, and his own extremely unique way of combining his amazing abilities as a scholar with his desire to be a citizen and his desire to be a helper. He was a coach in the latter part of his career, in effect. We owe a lot to him, and I sure wish I had that book with his signature in it. I'm going to sign off here on my sharing and give the floor back to Rick. Are you there?
I'm here, Charlie. You hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. So
All the way up there in Toronto, right?
I think we stick around for a while. I wanted to try and just share some of the things I feel and know about Moe.
Well, that was great. I'm sure everybody would join me in thanking you. I forgot to mention earlier that if you have any questions or any comments, because we're on a delay with YouTube, we can't have you unmute and ask questions. But if you put them on the chat, they'll be sent to me, and I'll ask those questions. But I have one to start with. You mentioned the great Hank Greenberg, who's probably, well, is the best hitter, a Jewish hitter. Now, he did face during his career overt anti-Semitism. I mean, they used to say things like, throw him a pork chop, he won't hit it. Why do you think Moe didn't face overt anti-Semitism in his major league career while Greenberg did? Any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. If Moe were a better player, it might have been different.
Yeah.
He didn't get to play that much. He had 1 or 2 full seasons. Then he hurt his knee. If you look at his official record, you'll see him playing 30, 25, 40 games as a substitute catcher throughout the last half of his career. So I think that anti-Semites who would have wanted to ride him, mock him, either from the stands where the fans were sitting or from the opposing players, he didn't factor into the game that much.
Mm-hmm.
But there was another thing, because Casey Stengel, the famous Casey Stengel, manager, player, and then manager of the Yankees, said that Moe always handled his knowledge and the fact that he was so well educated, playing with, for the most part, very uneducated professional baseball players. He handled it very softly. He didn't brag. He didn't show off. When he did have some fun with them, it was in good, it was with good cheer that he would make references to foreign languages and so on. So I think Moe's own personality, his friendliness with the other players, the fact that he was not haughty, contributed to him not being on the receiving end of much active anti-Semitism during his professional baseball career. It didn't hurt when he played for the Senators late in his career that everyone knew when the games were over, he would put on his famous suit jacket and go to receptions at the embassies, and he was seen with beautiful women and seen with leading heads of state. And the other players, in a sense, must have been in awe of him, the life he led after the game. It could not have been more different from the life of the ordinary baseball player.
Well, you mentioned about him living with his brother for 17 years, and it got to the point his brother did evict him, because here's a quote from his brother. He said, Moe became moody and snappish after the war. That's after he finished the OSS and CIA, and did not seem to care for much in life besides his books. So even though this was a personable guy, he became a bit of a semi-recluse.
He did, and there were signs of that early on. You know, in the latter part of his career, in the late 1930s, his roommates would say, and there was a photograph of this in the Aviva Kempner movie, Moe had so many books and newspapers, they would pile up in the room he was sharing with his roommate, like you would see with an elderly person who can't get rid of their stuff.
A hoarder.
Yes, and Moe would call the newspapers alive or dead. That would mean if he hadn't read it yet, the newspaper was alive and no one was to touch it. And he became enraged one time when I think the owner of the team came in to try to talk about the following year's contract and actually moved the newspapers off Moe's chair. So Moe was eccentric, and in his reclusive life, although he did go out to ball games, he was invited up to the press box. It's as if after the war, he left his social abilities behind.
Mm-hmm.
The way he could socialize with the ball player, the comfort he felt, that's why I showed that first picture. And then in the war, the intensity that he was required to put out to be a spy in Nazi-occupied Europe, it's as if he exhausted himself socially. And it's true, in the last years of his life, there were reports of him spending the entire day in the corner of old bookstores reading, and get this, what was he reading? Old Latin and Greek texts. He didn't read modern books. He stopped reading newspapers. It's as if he went back 2,000 years.
Wow. The Casey Stengel quote, I thought that I think it was him that you might have used, and I missed it story if you did. They said Moe spoke 7 languages but couldn't hit in any of them.
I know. He did have 1 or 2 good years hitting, but he was so slow. It was hard for him to get to first base, especially after he got hurt.
But at one point, he held a record, which has since been broken, for most consecutive, like the number of times he could catch people stealing. Like he had a cannon arm, right?
Yes, and the number of consecutive games he played without an error. He was a tremendous defensive catcher. And there's the famous story because he was signed as a shortstop, as an infielder. And the White Sox, early in his career, the main catcher got really hurt, and the 2 backup catchers each got hurt. And the manager looked down the bench and said, "Can anybody catch? We need a catcher." And Moe stood up to point to another teammate and said, "I heard that guy could catch." But the manager thought that Moe was standing up because he wanted to volunteer to catch. And the rest was history. It turned out that as a baseball player, that was his skill, even though it had not been his original position. What I loved from the Aviva Kempner movie was the early footage of Moe playing at Princeton, where he's a shortstop. And if you watch him catching and throwing the ball and moving across second base on a double play, he is tremendously athletic.
Yeah, very
defensively.
Fluid.
Very
fluid. Well, we have a question from one of our participants. This person says, I enjoyed the stock historical film cuts in the movie, but thought the popular Hollywood film cuts were distracting. What did you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think when people make a movie about Moe or try to write a book about him, uh, he was so secretive that they have to use the low-hanging fruit, you know? So if you make a spy movie, you make a movie fiction, you know, a feature film, you just turn it into the spy movie based on what we do know about his time as a spy. Uh, that's not the most interesting part of his life to me. To me, I am so interested in how this super intellectual kid chose baseball over a legal career, although he did later become a lawyer, but he hardly had much time to practice. And I'm also interested in the psychology of this man, how he knew many people in the heyday of his life, but never married, never made a family, never got that recognition from his father. And we know from other studies of spies and resistance fighters during World War II that some of them rose to the occasion with tremendous heroism and courage during the war. And after the war, the air went out of their balloon. They had trouble making a transition from the military life and its intensity to regular life. I don't know if we would call Moe unhappy. I mean, you know, I'm older than he was when he passed away, but maybe he was very happy reading those Latin and Greek books. But most of us looking in on it would say, my goodness, look at that old man. Why doesn't he have any friends?
An interesting thing, you mentioned that he never married. Apparently, his sister and brother never married either. And there was one thing I read that, whether it's been verified or not, they believe they may have been genetically predisposed to some, with Tay-Sachs or something like that. But I've not seen anything authoritative on that. You heard anything about that?
I don't know if the brother, Sam, would ever have been asked about that. I think I forgot to say, do you know that after the bombing of Nagasaki, Sam, who had become an army doctor, was sent into Nagasaki to do some of the follow-up research and studies for the U.S. Armed Forces on the effect of the atomic blast. And I thought it's so ironic that these two brothers, one winds up as a spy against the Nazis, the other winds up in the radiation fields of Nagasaki. And Sam, the brother, who's interviewed in a BIJFF film, wound up having serious questions about whether or not the atomic bomb had to be dropped and whether or not following the war, something more could have been done to prevent the nuclear arms race. But can you imagine kicking his own brother out after 17 years of living together, after all they've been through?
Yeah, it's written that he actually got an eviction notice, but then no left. Charlie, thank you very much. We have also some film buffs here as well as baseball fans. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Viva Kempner and her career because she has a story of her own.
Terrific.
And I hope I can get this thing to work. There we are. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. You can see it?
I can see it, Charles.
This is Aviva who did the film, and this was her fourth film about American Jewish heroes. But she has an interesting story too. Her mother was a Holocaust survivor from Poland who was hidden and posed as a Catholic in Germany after the war or during the war, and met her husband, who was also an immigrant to the United States who joined the American Army. And they met in Berlin, and she was born there. They moved to Detroit. Her father was similar to what you talked about with your father, Charlotte. She, Briggs Stadium, the old Briggs Stadium, Tiger fans and all that kind of thing. So she's done a number of films. The first one she did was about freedom fighters in Lithuania during the war. The Untold Story of Jewish Resistance. Now, you notice it says DVD down there. I tried to search whether any of these films that she's done are available on streaming, and they're not. Like, she has her own company, and you can buy, like through Amazon, you can buy the DVDs, but you can't get them like through Netflix or so on. This was the one that really made her well known, won a lot of awards in 1998, The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. And he's worthy of another session maybe next year, Charlie. We'll let you do some work on Hank Greenberg, okay? And a non-baseball film, some of you may have seen this, You Who, Mrs. Goldberg, the whole story of Gertrude Berg and her television show. And you know, it says from the maker of The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. This film, I think, did play in the theaters, but most of her films did not. They're used at festivals like ours is, and so on. I hate to admit that I didn't know much about Julius Rosenwald, but this film is about the founder of Sears Roebuck, who was a Jewish philanthropist from Illinois, who worked with Booker T. Washington and set up thousands of schools for African-American kids in the Jim Crow South. And this interesting quote that that's attributed to him: "The horrors that are due to race prejudice come home to the Jew more forcefully than to others." He also was friends with Sachs and Goldman Sachs, and bought a company and turned it into a multi-million-dollar business. Here's Aviva with Brad Osmus, and this was taken last year when Osmus managed the Angels. He lost that job. He works in the Angels front office now. But a lot of people don't know that Brad Osmus has played more games as a Jewish ball player than anybody in history. Something like, I think I have it here, 1,971 games. 1,971 games. He played 18 years for 4 teams and was the manager of the Israeli team in the last Olympics. So because he played in Detroit and managed the Tigers, she got to know him, and I thought that was an interesting photo. And this is the one you mentioned, the film. Now, this is available on Amazon Prime. I haven't seen it. It's a dramatization of Moe Berg. It didn't get good reviews. Have you seen it, Charlie?
No, I was turned off by the partial reviews, and I'll see it someday. But I've been too much of a purist to watch it.
Well, I may, after all this and all the excitement you've created for us, I may look for it. And I have another reason for looking for this. We're trying to track it down, but we're almost sure that Paul Rudd is a distant cousin of mine.
Okay.
Yeah, because his family came from the same place my mother's family came from, and his name was also Rudnitsky, which was our family name on my mother's side. But you notice Jeff Daniels, Guy Pearce, Paul Giamatti. So it might be worth looking at after seeing the Kempner movie. Anyways, let me see if there's any more questions. I don't think there are. Let me see. So I'll turn it over to Katie. And thanks again, Charlie. I hope to see you once the border opens up and we can get together again.
Be safe. Be kind, Rick.
Okay.
All right. Well, I just, in closing, want to say thank you to you both. Rick, thank you for facilitating tonight and also for connecting us to Charles. He was actually, I know that we had scheduled you to do the introduction of The Spy Behind Home Plate in our in-person festival that was supposed to happen in March. And I think you were going to give a little bit of a presentation, but I don't think we would have gotten as much as we did tonight. So I think all in all, we actually won out on being able to do it this way, and worked out since you're not able to cross the border. But you certainly are a wealth of knowledge on baseball and Moe Berg. So thank you for joining us and sharing that with us tonight. I also just want to thank our cultural arts sponsors, the M&T Bank, County of Erie, Town of Amherst, the Wolk Foundation, and the Buffalo Jewish Federation. And I want to thank Esther Arbide, the Cultural Arts Director of the JCC in Toronto. I know Charles mentioned that we probably have a lot of viewers from Canada. So she helped us to promote the festival as well as tonight's event, and we're glad that you joined us. Again, if we can't cross the border, at least it was nice to get together virtually, and we now share the baseball team for a little bit. So it's very nice. And finally, I just want to encourage you all to continue to check the JCC website as well as our film festival website. We'll have more upcoming programs and events coming up. And on behalf of the festival committee and myself, thank you for supporting the festival. We hope that you enjoyed all of the films and events that we presented. And we're very much looking forward to doing it again, hopefully soon in person, as well as maybe virtually again. So thank you, everybody.
Can I show my Blue Jays mask?
Please do.
There we are. I'm all set for the Buffalo Blue Jays. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Charlie.
All right. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.